Yeah, so fellowship, it is such an honor, honestly, for me to be with you. Huntington Drive campus, love being with you. And I've been a raving fan of your church, really since its beginning. And I've kind of walked the journey from afar with you. And love your senior pastor, obviously. He's become a dear, dear friend and brother in Christ. And just on behalf of Stadia, the organization that I have the absolute privilege to lead, let me say thank you to every single one of you. Planting churches that intentionally care for children all around the world. You know, our vision, along with you, is to make sure that every child on the planet has a church. You think about the difference Jesus makes in our lives as we're growing up, and children are so receptive to the gospel-centered message of Jesus. And new church planting remains the single most effective way of reaching people with the good news of Jesus Christ. And so thank you on behalf of all of those children and adults already around the world that you've helped reach with the good news of Jesus Christ. Thank you for our partnership. You know, I love coming out here. I love California. I find it difficult to eat here. You know, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and you all eat kind of weird. I'm from the heartland, the Midwestern town kind of, and I mean, I go to your restaurants out here, and there are things on the menu. Free-range tofu balls. I mean, what the heck? Organic veggie burgers laden with lentil sprouts. Yeah, that sounds good. Whole grain soy rice bok choy. You know, we don't have bok choy in Ohio. Yeah, you chase it with coconut, probiotic, antioxidant muscle milk. Now, back in Ohio, I start my day with cinnamon baked apples, honey biscuits, hash brown casserole, chicken fried steak, slathered in gravy. And that's just breakfast. Now, we all know we need to take care of our bodies, right? I mean, we know that. I mean, it's vacation time. We're talking about these water activities. We're going to be in bathing suits. We want to be able to take our t-shirts off. We want our bodies to look good. But that's not the real reason we want to take care of our bodies. Excuse me. The real reason we want to take care of our bodies is we go back to the creation story in Genesis chapter 2, verse 27. And it's because we're created in God's image. Genesis 2:27 says, God created human beings, all of humanity, in his own image. In the image of God, he created you, them, male and female. The image of God, the imago Dei in Latin. Now, it's harder to see the image of God in some bodies more than others, if we're just candid, right? And I have to tell you that I've seen more God bodies out here in California than I do in Ohio. It might be the gravy. You know, when I'm at home and I take my shirt off, my wife says, you know, Greg, I'm not sure how much of God I see in you, but I certainly see Buddha. Wives, do not say that to your husbands. Not a good thing. Humanity is created in the image of God. The image of God is all around us, but we have to be able to see it. Now, I want to take you back to a story in the Bible. Excuse me. I've been traveling in Peru the last couple weeks. I picked up a nasty cold on the flight home. This story in the Bible takes place around 1300 BC. Exodus chapter 1, but I'm just going to walk through it. The Hebrew nation, God's chosen children, the Israelites, another name for them, have been enslaved by the powerful Egyptian people, by Pharaoh. But the Hebrews are prolific. In other words, they're able to have children at the drop of a hat, kind of like your senior pastor. Uncle Greg, yeah. So Pharaoh decrees that every Hebrew baby boy that's going to be born must be thrown into the Nile River and to be drowned. It's horrible. Exodus chapter 2. Little baby boy is born to a Hebrew mom and dad. His name is Moses. Moses' mom can't bring herself to throw him into the river and drown, so she puts him into a reed basket where he floats in the Nile River, sends her little girl, her little daughter, to watch over the basket. And of all the crazy things, Pharaoh's daughter walks down to the river. She hears the baby crying probably. She opens the basket. There's a little Hebrew baby, and she wants to take the puppy home. And so the older sister comes over and says, Miss Pharaoh's daughter, how about if I get you a Hebrew woman to be the nanny of this baby? And Pharaoh's daughter thinks that's a great idea, and so daughter goes and gets mom of Moses, and Moses' mom becomes the nanny of her own baby in Pharaoh's household. And so Pharaoh grows up. Moses grows up in Pharaoh's household. And Moses has all the privileges of living in the royal family, all the wealth, everything that goes with it. A few years later, Moses is probably in his late teens or early 20s. Moses goes outside and he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Moses is angry. He kills the Egyptian, buries him in the sand. Very convenient. The next day, Moses goes out again, and he sees two Hebrews this time fighting. And he says, hey, stop the fight. And one of the Hebrews says, Moses, what are you going to do? Kill us like you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And Moses knows he is busted. And so he leaves Pharaoh's household and he runs away, literally, far away to a land called Midian. And he becomes a shepherd, which is what his people really are. Now, years go by, and back in Egypt, God begins to hear the cries, the prayers of his people crying out in Egypt against the slavery of the Egyptians. And so God pays Moses a visit out in the desert where Moses is being a shepherd because that's what his people do. And Moses comes upon a bush that is burning but is not consumed. You've heard of this story, right? Moses and the burning bush. And Moses sees the bush burning and he stands there, and all of a sudden God addresses Moses, who he has chosen to lead his people out of slavery. Moses. Here I am. Moses, take off your shoes, because the ground on which you're standing, the place that you're standing, is holy ground. Now, why was that ground holy? Because Moses was in the presence of God. And whenever you're in the presence of God, you're standing on holy ground. Think about it. My mom, she used to make me take off my shoes when I was a kid when I would come in the house from playing. And if I didn't take them off, she would always yell at me. She'd yell, Greg, were you born in a barn? Do they say that in California, or is that just an Ohio thing? That's one of the things that Jesus' mom could never say to him. Be like, yeah, Mom. Take off your shoes because you're in the presence of God. Now, the presence of God is sometimes difficult to see, but it's all around us. Moses saw God in a burning bush. God had to get his attention. And I think creation is that way sometimes for all of us, that God uses us to get our attention for his presence. It could be in the majesty of a mountain, right? It could be at the ocean for some of you, or a serene lake, or a babbling brook, a beautiful flower, or the song of a bird. But do any of you find God's presence in nature? But the presence of God is sometimes more difficult to see in people, especially in myself. Sometimes it's most difficult for us to be aware of or see the presence of God in our own lives. Now remember, people, humanity, we're created in the image of God. All of humanity. So that means that you are created in the image of God. And for some of you, that's all you need to hear today. You are created in the image of God. The Imago Dei. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to invite you to take off your shoes right now. No joke, I mean it. I want you to take off your shoes. Here we go. Because you are on holy ground. Why? Whew. Did you guys take baths? No, I'm just kidding. Because when you are alone with yourself, because you are created in the image of God, you are in God's presence. It's holy ground. When you are in the presence of others, because they're created in the Imago Dei, it's holy ground. Take off your shoes. 1 Corinthians 3:16 says, you realize, don't you, that you are the temple, the home, the dwelling place of the living God. That God himself lives in you. Now let that one sink in. God lives in you. You are a burning bush. So Moses was raised believing that he was created in the image of God. Because remember, his Hebrew mom's his nanny, so she's teaching him all this stuff. But he's raised in Pharaoh's household with all these pagan gods, these false gods being worshiped around him. But his mom's teaching him the true creation story. Moses, you're created in the image of the one true living God. But after a while, I have to wonder if Moses quit believing that he was a reflection of God's image. That he stopped seeing God in himself and as a result in those around him. He was raised in Pharaoh's household, but he started thinking about his adoption. Is he Hebrew? And he just started thinking, maybe I'm not royalty after all. And maybe when he was with his buddy Pharaoh-ish friends, and they started talking about the stinky Hebrews, the shepherds that the Egyptians despised. Because shepherds stink. In the King James Version of the Bible, it says they stinketh. And maybe as they're making fun of the Hebrew shepherds, Moses started thinking, that's me. I stinketh. And so Moses goes out and he sees two men fighting and he kills a man. And he loses all sense of that man or himself being created in God's image. And Moses runs away. And we, you and I, have a tendency to run away as well. Because we forget that we are created in God's image, in the Imago Dei. Now, like Moses, my son, our son, my wife and I's son, Elijah, is adopted. He's this beautiful little black boy that we adopted when he was 3 weeks old from Cleveland, Ohio, because Cleveland rocks. And there are times, it just happened this past week, in fact, when Elijah, who's 10 now, I'll be sitting with him on our couch, and I'll actually be holding him in my arms and scratching his back because he still likes that and lets Dad do that. And we're watching TV together, and I will be overwhelmed with love for Elijah, my adopted son. And I'll think to myself, I can't imagine loving this little boy any more than I do. I just can't imagine it. And he's adopted. But do you know one of the most important things that my wife Julie and I can teach Elijah as he grows up? It's that he's created in the image of God. And that his identity does not come from the fact that his biological mom could not take care of him. It does not come from the fact that Julie and I adopted him into our family. It comes from the fact that he is God's son, adopted into God's family. He is created in the image of God, the imago Dei. Romans chapter 8, verse 15 says, God adopted you as his child, and it gives you the right, you and I, to cry out to him and to say, Daddy. The same way my little boy Elijah will cry out to me, Dad. So parents, let me talk to you for just a moment. One of the most important things that you can teach your children is that they are created in the image of God. That's where their identity rests. I mean, if you want to protect your children in school, teach them that their identity rests in the fact that they are created in the image of God. They are not who others say they are. If you want them to have a healthy self-image, teach them that they carry the imago Dei. If you want them to stand up against peer pressure, then teach them that their strength is actually God living in them. It's his strength lived out through them. And students, let me talk to you for just a few moments. The most important thing, one of the most important things you can recognize and never, ever, ever forget is that you are created in God's image. Because there will be times that other students will say hurtful things to you, damaging things to you. There may be times when even teachers will degrade you. Social media is an absolute mess for you students. Bullying is rampant. And for many of you, your body image will be challenged. Students, remember who you are. Remember whose you are. Imago Dei, God in you. So I hold my adopted son Elijah, and I just can't imagine him loving him anymore. And then the Spirit of God washes over me. It just happened again this last week. And the Spirit of God reminds me that I am adopted by God. And that God loves me as his adopted son even more than I can humanly love my son Elijah. And sometimes I sit by myself in my bedroom, actually, with my shoes off, because I have to remind myself, because life is hard, and I start to forget that God lives in me, and that I'm not who others think I am or say I am, for good or for bad, but that I am God's adopted son. And I listen to worship music and Chris Tomlin's, his great worship song. It's one of my favorites. And Good, Good Father, if you heard that. It comes on. You're a good, good father. That's who you are. That's who you are. And I'm loved by you. That's who I am. That's who I am. And I just sit in God's presence with my shoes off as he lives in me. Because I forget. I forget, and I begin to recall the myriad of mistakes that I've made in my life. I start tying my identity, who I believe I am, how valuable I am, to my career. I forget, and I begin to compare myself to others, and suddenly the burning bush of my life has become cold ashes. And that's why there are times in my life when I have to sit and take off my shoes, to remind myself of who I am, whose I am, that God has chosen to live within me, that I am created in the image of God, the Imago Dei. I am a burning bush of God's presence. And so are you. And so our starting point is to sit by ourselves and take off our shoes, because when we're alone, no one else in the room, we are in the presence of God, because God lives within us. But here's the challenge. If we can't see God in ourselves, then we will never fully see God in others. Did you get that? If we can't see God in ourselves, we will never fully see God in others. And so we have to learn to take off our shoes in the presence of others. Now I have a confession to make. It is difficult for me to take off my shoes in your presence. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and it is difficult for me to see God in you. 2 words: LeBron James. I'm just going to stop. Now, if we can come to an understanding of who we really are, that God himself lives within us, then we can begin to see God in others, the Imago Dei. We can begin to see burning bushes all around us. Now go back to Moses. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's household, the best teachers, the finest food, all of the privileges of status and wealth. And I have to wonder if Moses maybe began to believe his own press. That his identity wasn't because he was created in God's image, but rather in what society and culture told him that he was. That maybe he really was better than others. At least some others. I have to wonder on that day that he saw the Egyptian beating the Hebrew, perhaps he thought to himself, was he above it all? When he saw the 2 Hebrews fighting the next day, that he was thinking about his royal position. You see, we can start doing that, you and I, based on our race or education, our success or status, our physique or sexual orientation. We can start thinking that we are inherently better than others. It happens to me when I'm at a restaurant and I don't think the server is paying enough attention to me. It happens when I'm in line at the grocery store and the elderly couple in front of me is paying with cash, of all things, counting out the exact change, coin by coin by coin, and I start thinking that my time is more valuable than theirs. When I'm on my cell phone at Starbucks and I place my order, but I barely give the barista the time of day. No burning bushes around me that I can see. But let me tell you when it's most painful for me. It's when I've worked all day. When I've preached 3 times at Monrovia. I've tried to be kind, treated people with respect, encouraged people, pour it into you as best I can. I did my best to listen well, honestly. And then I fly home, and I'm tired. And believe it or not, but I can be cranky. I just want some alone time. And I treat the love of my life, my wife, Julie, unkindly. I'm short with her. I'm preoccupied. I don't listen well. I mean, she wasn't out serving Jesus like me all weekend. She was just taking care of our kids. No burning bush in that interaction, is there? Or my 10-year-old son Elijah walks into the living room where I'm on my iPad booking my next flight. No, I don't have time to play basketball with you. Or my 19-year-old daughter Tabitha wants me to watch her latest dance video on YouTube, and I only half pay attention. No burning bushes in that room. And I'll tell you what, when I admit those honestly to you, it hurts me. When do you find it most difficult to see God's image in others? To take off your shoes? Who is it that you know that is most difficult for you personally to remember that they are a burning bush created in the image of God? You see, friends, when we're in the presence of Muslims, as followers of Jesus created in the Imago Dei, what do? We take off our shoes. As reflections of the image of God, when we are in the presence of homeless people, what do? We take off our shoes. As burning bushes ourselves, when we are in the presence of someone with a different sexual orientation, regardless of what you feel about that, that person is created in the image of God. We take off our shoes as the beginning point. When we are with Lakers fans, you leave your shoes on. I'm still struggling. Students, you're getting ready to head back to school, right? When you walk into the cafeteria this fall or in the next couple of weeks, and you see that other student sitting by himself or herself at the cafeteria table, that loner, what do? You take off your shoes. When you see that special needs student struggling to carry their textbooks, what do? You take off your shoes and you help them. When you see that boy called on class to read out loud and he always struggles and he stammers and people start snickering around him, what do? You take off your shoes. When you're the great athlete on the sports team and that clumsy kid's put on your team, what do? You take off your shoes because that young man or young lady is created in the image of God. And we treat people appropriately. We take off our shoes. And so everyone, when you're at those family gatherings, when there's one relative at least that drinks far too much at every family gathering, what do? We take off our shoes. When we're with that political person or people who can't stop talking about Donald Trump, one way or the other, what do? We take off our shoes. When we walk into our home at the end of a long day to greet our spouse, what do? We take off our shoes. When you are that person staying home and your spouse comes home at the end of a long day, what do? You take off your shoes. God's presence just walked in the room. When you drop your kids off at your ex-spouse's house for the weekend, what do? You take off your shoes. Now, I might have crossed the line there, but when your child or your children walk into the room, what do? We take off our shoes. Now, I have one tattoo on my body. And I was a little concerned about that, telling this story when I came in, because I thought some of you might not, like tattoos or be, but then I saw your staff. And I was actually sitting by Michael Fields, your host up here today, campus guy, and he bent over, and do you know he has this little butterfly right here? Yeah, not really, but he does have some tattoos, I saw him. So I was gonna tell you, please, if you don't like tattoos, listen to this story of how I got mine, and just keep your shoes off for me for a few more seconds. I was in Israel. I went to the city of Jerusalem, and I got my one tattoo a couple years ago. And it simply says on my wrist, Imago Dei, Latin for image of God. And I got it intentionally on my wrist so I could see it, so that every time I look up at it, I am reminded that Greg Nettle is created in the image of God. Because I forget. But I think even more importantly for me, I got it because every time I greet someone, when I reach out and shake their hand or hug them or get my coffee, I see it on my wrist. And I'm reminded that every person I encounter, every person, is created in the image of God. Now, some of us need to be reminded to take off our shoes when we're sitting by ourselves, right? That we have God's presence in us, and that's what you need to hear today. Others of us need to be reminded to take off our shoes when we're in the presence of others, regardless of who that is, because we're in God's presence. I needed both reminders. But one last story. For the past 2 weeks, my wife and I have been in Peru, South America, before coming out here to California. And my wife and I had the privilege of trekking the Salcantay Trail to Machu Picchu. It was more than 50 miles through the mountains over 7 days at 15,000 feet of altitude to get to the ancient ruins of Machu Picchu. And it was really one of those trips of a lifetime. It was on our bucket list. And there were times along that trek when we saw unimaginable, majestic mountains over 20,000 feet, snow-capped, glacier-capped high, where we saw glacier lakes beneath us, the ancient ruins. And I'll tell you what, it was those times that would literally knock your shoes off because you would sense God's presence. But let me tell you, in Peru, when my shoes really came off, Julie and I, our family, sponsors a little girl named Natalie. She's 12 years old. She lives in the jungles of Peru in abject poverty. We do that sponsorship through Stadia and Compassion, that partnership, like you do in South America. And so Julie and I, when we flew into Lima, we actually in advance had paid for Natalie and her mom to come to Lima so that we could spend the day with them and meet little Natalie for the very first time. And so we're there in a park overlooking the ocean, and little 12-year-old Natalie is so excited. I mean, she's just beside herself. And why? It was her first time that she'd ever seen the ocean in her life, living in the jungle. And so right then and there, I look down at the ocean, and we're on this huge cliff overlooking. It's about a half mile away. And I think to myself, not only is Natalie going to see the ocean for the first time, but she's going to feel the water on her feet. She is not leaving here and going back to the jungle without stepping in that ocean. And so my wife and I hire a cab, and we drive down with Natalie and her mom to the beach, and it's this stone beach, and the rocks are terrible to walk on, and the surf is too high, and I'm scared, but I'm like, we're gonna get in this water together, Natalie. And so Natalie and I sit down on these rocks on this beach, and we take off our socks, and we take off our shoes. And we stand up, and Natalie puts her little 12-year-old hand in mine. And we walk into the water together. And she starts giggling. And I start crying. And I look at her, and we're just two kids, really, from opposite sides of the world who happen to have the same dad. Two burning bushes. Right? Shoeless in the water. Take off your shoes. Because the place on which you're standing is holy ground.